listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. Our guest today is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian. He's the author of over 15 books, including Faith After Doubt, A Generous Orthodoxy, and A New Kind of Christian, which got me in a whole lot of trouble at my home church 20 years ago. His new book, Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned, is an absolute must-read for any Christian struggling to make sense of things in this crazy world we live in. It is an absolute joy and honor to welcome to the podcast Brian McLaren.
Well, a joy and honor for me to be with you guys. So glad to be here.
Yes, I was thrilled to death to get the email confirming that you had time in your very busy schedule to be with us today. We're all big fans, and I'm sure a lot of folks of our listenership likewise.
Well, hey, and I got to say now that I know about you guys, I'm your fan as well. And this subject of the interaction between faith and science, my goodness, so important these days. So really happy to be in this conversation.
Yes.
Thank you.
I love the way that you weave these two things together in your writings, by the way. And I've noticed it really in the past 10 years worth of books or so. It seems almost effortless that every once in a while you're just going to get some reference in there to evolution, some reference in there to the cosmic origins of the universe. It just seems like it is always somewhere in the back of your mind.
Well, maybe I could say it this way: without science, I don't think I could be a Christian. I can't imagine how anyone would want to have a faith where they had to keep their faith in one compartment and then everything else in another compartment. So.
Right. Yeah.
Huh. Well, that's a sound clip that I'll definitely use.
Absolutely.
So Ian and I have been talking a lot recently about your new book, which when the time this podcast launches will have been released yesterday. So available at all of your major retailers. So this book, which is just so helpfully entitled, Do I Stay Christian? Answers that question, which I think a lot of folks have had over the past couple of years especially. But it's very helpfully organized into 3 sections. To answer that question, that no, I will not stay Christian, and here's why. Yes, I will stick it out and stay Christian. And the last section is how. Which of those sections is taking up the most real estate in your mind, in your day-to-day life?
Well, let's see. I think all of them jostle for the top position. But I think actually the writing of this book propelled the third question up in importance, because in the writing of this book, I realized it's just inevitable. Some people cannot stay Christian. The religion is killing them. It's damaging them. They need to get away, at least for a time. And other people will stay Christian. It's who they are, and how could they deny who they are? And then what I realized is, even whatever you decide on staying Christian, you have to wake up the next morning and ask, what kind of a human being am I going to be? And that I hope that the reading of the book helps lift the importance of that question up for everybody.
Well, and Brian, I really appreciated that aspect of the book. And as I said before recording, I absolutely loved the book. So for me, I don't have the kind of historical experiences that I know, Brian, you talk about in your books and that Zack has had and talked about before, feeling that I needed to leave, like deconstruct and then come back or anything like that. But one of the things that I've always struggled with is, and you do so well in the first several chapters when the answer to your question is no, all those chapters explaining no just really stood out for me. And so, sorry, I know I'm rambling. This is normal for me. But at the end, I loved, as you just said too, connecting it back to what kind of human do we want to be? I tell people a lot when they question my faith, because I'm open with my doubts and questions and the idea of a literal resurrection and things. Those are all questions and doubts I have, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to resolve them.
Yeah.
But I think I prefer to think of it as that I want to live my life fighting for what Jesus fought for.
What a great way to say it.
Right. And so if it's more of that's the way I live, I don't have to stand on a rooftop and scream, everyone be a Christian. It's more of a, this is the life I want to live. And I love that you did that.
And isn't it ironic that major sectors of the Christian religion are really uninterested whether you want to fight for the things Jesus fought for? They're really interested in whether you will check certain boxes of agreeing with their authority figures about what you're supposed to say about Jesus. So I just can't help but think that Jesus would be happier with someone who's ready to join him in the struggle. His word for that was follow me, than have certain opinions about me. In fact, there's that passage in the Gospels where he says, I really don't care if you call me Lord, Lord. I mean, what difference does that make, the words you use about me, if you don't do what I say? So, yeah.
Right. Well, and in this book, and also too in your podcast, Learning How to See, you start off talking about something that was very close to me. So I got my PhD from the University of Virginia. And so my wife and I were in Charlottesville. It was the first place we really lived as a young married couple. We were there from 2004 to 2008. And so when the situation happened in Charlottesville in August of 2017, that was very challenging for us because the grounds of UVA are places I spent 4 years of my life, that we loved that town. And so that was very challenging for us. And then hearing you on your podcast and reading this book, I would love to, if you could talk more about that experience, because I didn't realize you were there. And so I'm just curious if you can kind of talk about that.
Yeah. Well, the story of how I ended up there was kind of interesting. I had introduced this couple to each other who ended up getting married, and both were seminary graduates. And so they were a ministry couple in Charlottesville, and they contacted me and they said, look, Brian, you may not have even heard about this. And I hadn't. It turns out, before, was it August 10th? I've forgotten the date now. Whatever the date was in August, they'd had a series of Ku Klux Klan rallies. It was like, a lot of people don't know this, but there is a group of people who are planning for a civil war. And they want to make Charlottesville the capital of the new Confederacy.
I did not know that part.
Yeah, it's scary and it's crazy stuff, but and yeah, very disturbing. And they said, so a really big one is coming in August, and we're trying to get clergy to come support us and to stand with us. And they said, we're finding a lot of clergy of color, and we're finding a lot of women clergy who will come. We're really finding it hard to get white male clergy to come. And of course, there's a big supply of them, but they just couldn't get them to come. So they said, is there any chance you could come? You need to know it's going to be dangerous. There are going to be a lot of guns there. Several militia have already signed up to be there, and they'll all come heavily armed. And I said, I'm not going to tell that last part to my wife, but yes, I would be honored to be there. So, and actually she knew that there would be some danger, and she made me make certain promises to her about what I would do and not do when I was there. But it was just an experience I'll never forget. First, seeing how organized these folks were. They were super, super highly organized. I was invited into a meeting, an Antifa meeting of people who were organizing to try to not let these folks sort of rule the city for a day. And I never thought in my lifetime I would see people carrying Confederate flags and Nazi flags and a bunch of other flags, along with Bibles and other Christian paraphernalia. I never thought I would see that. And of course, and I happened to be just up the street when Heather Hare and was killed, and others were injured by a guy using a car as a terrorist weapon to drive through a crowd. And a group of us clergy went. I was wearing, black leather shoes, and I just remember the feeling of my feet slapping against the ground as I ran down this hill into this crowd where there was chaos and people screaming and crying. And so an experience I'll never forget. But then January 6th, 2021 happened, and I just thought, there they are again, And in between, I'd organized a public event here in Florida, where I live, where we had been, our event was disrupted and the entrances were blocked by the Proud Boys. So this has been a big part of my experience, and watching the complicity of major sectors of the Christian faith with these folks has been, it's highly significant in the way I wrote this book, Do I Stay Christian? Because I feel like that, I wish I'd put this sentence in the book, but it only became clear to me actually in the last few days that one of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did, and I took those first 10 chapters to really take the no seriously, is because I am worried that those 10 chapters give a kind of overview of some of Christianity's crimes and through the centuries. I'm worried that the worst things Christianity has ever done will be exceeded in the next few years. That's why I feel anyone who stays Christian better be aware of the danger that our religion poses to this world and to many of our neighbors. And that then puts a kind of responsibility on us to say, if I'm going to inhabit this religion, I better take responsibility for trying to stand up to some of the harm that it is in danger of doing. And not just in danger of doing, it is actually doing, as we speak.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're not just complicit in the rise and spread of white supremacy. Western Christianity is the author of white supremacy. It is very much our child, and it is completely inseparably intertwined with Western Christianity as we know it. And so this is not an issue for the Black church to figure out or to lead us in. This is not an issue for people of color to be taking charge. This is our problem, our sin, and our need to work on, to fix, to fight. And you're somebody who's been at the front lines of that, it seems. What can the rest of us do? Us white Christians out here, how can we help fight this scourge? I mean, just look, even as recording this, we just witnessed another white supremacist kill 10 people in a Buffalo grocery store. And by the time that this podcast launches, who knows
else will happen?
There will be another one. It just seems like we're just spinning our wheels at this point.
Well, let me say first, I really agree with you that white Christians really have a responsibility right now. And one of our responsibilities is to listen to the cries and the agony and the frustration of our neighbors of color who are just, who can blame them for saying, if they hear thoughts and prayers one more time, I mean, it's just, yeah. So here's one thing I think we can do. I think we can all make a commitment that we will never let a racially harmful statement go unchallenged. And I think we have to learn how to challenge them in ways that don't create a worse blowback. But silence is its own vote of confidence and its own vote of support for outrageous, immoral, harmful, dangerous statements. So my little recommendation to people is that you develop your own version of this 5-word statement. Here's my version of it. Wow, I see that differently. It's instead of, you're such a bigot, it's I see that differently. I throw a wow in there because I want to add a little bit of emotional intensity without having to yell or scream. Wow, I see that differently. And almost every time I say that, people say, what do you mean? What do you mean? And if it's in public, I say to them, I'd rather talk to you about this in private. If you'd like to ask me about it in private some other time, I'll be glad to talk to you. And the reason I say that, and there might be times to have the conversation in public, but what I've noticed is that anytime these conversations happen in public, egos are so involved. People are defending them. Mm-hmm. People are performing their loyalty to whatever group it is. And so it seldom becomes an act of communication and usually becomes the kind of argument that hardens people in their positions. And I would like to be someone who helps little cracks form in their position or helps soften their position. And if I can set up the terms of that discussion, then I'll say to them, if you're ever curious about why I see things differently and how I came to see things differently, I'll be glad to have that conversation with you in private. Just let me know when you'd like to know how I came to see things differently, because I'm not asking them to tell me how they see things. I'll listen respectfully if they want, but I've been listening respectfully. That's what got us into this situation. And so, wow, I see that differently is my mantra in these circumstances.
Well, that's very disarming, I think.
And I feel, I feel it's honest and it's non-aggressive, but it also is an act of protest, and it's just an act of differing boldly yet hopefully graciously, non-hatefully, So, right. Yeah. And frankly, I'll just say, frankly, late in the book, there in that house section of the book, there's a chapter called Announce and Renounce, or Renounce and Announce. And in some ways, it's the same thing. It's having more and more of us just have the courage to say, I am not where you are. And to do it in a way that says, it's not that I hate you. It's not that I am going to insult you. In fact, I'm going to just state in a way that says, nothing's changing in our relationship, but I'm not where you are. If that creates a problem for you, then we'll deal with it. But I need to let you know, I can be at a different place than you are.
I thought that story you told in that chapter about John Ray and Amanda was really powerful. And one of the phrases that stood out, it was after, early on in the story, when John Ray comes back to Amanda and says, I was confronted by your father for 20 minutes. And the phrase that you used in the book was, he felt that he was in the presence of Christian hate.
Yes.
And I thought that was just those 4 words or 5 words. Yeah, 4 words. Presence of Christian hate just really kind of caught me. Because I feel like that's what we're seeing a lot of right now.
Yes. Yes. And of course, Christians will say that's not hate, that's love. And they're satisfied with that. But there is something really ugly going on. It's just ugly. And I've experienced it. And my gosh, when you're on Twitter and Facebook, I grew up fundamentalist. And part of being a fundamentalist is you didn't cuss and you didn't use crude language, and you felt this obligation to be decent and respectful. But my gosh, the profanity and it's just shocking to me to see what people are doing in the name of Jesus, and it's all sort of acceptable. And of course, some of this is because they're imitating their new leader, Donald Trump, who's in a sense the new leader of their denomination that has newly formed. And part of this is just stuff that's been in the American psyche for a long time. And maybe we're better with the profanity because it's, somebody said, when I mentioned I've had a lot of interactions with the Proud Boys, they said it's just the KKK with that, and the sheets are off. And I think there's some truth to that. So this is a historical reckoning that needed to happen. So better now than not letting it happen, letting it fester for another 100 years.
Yeah, that chapter, which kind of tells the story of a couple whose ideologies had changed, their faith had changed, and they hadn't really let their family know, which I think a lot of folks who have deconstructed can relate to, because they're afraid of then being renounced by their family. And she gathers up the courage after her husband has been sort of accosted for 20 minutes to go up and just tell her father, this is how it's going to be from here on out. And you talked about that in terms of a coming out story for her. And that framing, I think, is really helpful, and something that queer theologians, this gift that they have given us, this idea of coming out. It is a vulnerable experience in which you can be hurt in all new ways, but it is such an empowering experience. I read one theologian referred to John 1 as God's coming out.
Oh my.
That Jesus' incarnation is him showing who he truly is to the world and offering up himself to be either accepted in new ways or hurt in all new ways. And I honestly had never understood the incarnation until then. But this idea that those of us who are straight, cis, hetero folks who have never had the need to come out to people, to tell them, this is how you have perceived me, but this is how I truly am. We've just always been known for who we are. That this is something that we should learn, that we should need to love louder than the hate, and that we need to be more vocal. It's not enough to just love on our own, but that we need to love loudly and outly.
Yeah, another little saying that has kind of been sitting with me lately is I would rather be rejected for who I am than accepted for who I am not. And,
I wrote that down.
Well,
like I want to tattoo that on my arm or something, because I think that's such a powerful phrase. It really is.
And I think one of the things that just saying it that way helps me do is realize that the fear of rejection has so much power over so many of us. And as someone who's experienced a bit of rejection, and now I know Zack has led to other people to being rejected. So, but it's not the end of the world. It's not the worst thing that ever happens to you. In fact, some pretty amazing positive things can happen in the experience of rejection. So. And isn't it interesting in the Gospels? This is really a major theme of Jesus' teaching. Hey guys, if you take seriously what I'm saying, you're going to be rejected. Here's what's going to happen, and then we're surprised when it happens.
Right. The high priest is going to block you on Twitter at this point, and
I think you mentioning the rejection, and the fear of rejection. I mean, that's something that cripples me at times. With my own work of wanting to write as an academic for a more public audience, it's something that holds me back quite a bit. And reading, your book has helped, and then also Rob Bell's work as well, of helping me remember that I cannot control people's reactions to my work and my message.
And if we're writing about things that matter, then there are things that people have strong opinions about and they have vested interests in. And so, of course, there'll be pushback. Like, every once in a while I have to sit down with myself and just say, of course people get upset. What were you expecting to get a Nobel Prize? It's like, of course they get upset. So, and that's just the territory. And it's part of the privilege of talking about things that really matter and working on things that matter. So
I like that.
It doesn't make it easy, but it does. I think it's something we have to do that helps us navigate through those first few experiences of rejection that can either scar us for life or become our hazing for a membership in a new community.
Yeah, I've experienced a lot of the dirty underbelly of the Christian church growing up in the back rooms of the church and then being a part of church leadership. The first 10 chapters of your book where you talk about all the reasons why you should leave Christianity, at the end of every chapter, I thought to myself, I know where he's going. I know there's a part 2, but I'm almost ready to just close the book here and be like, yeah, no, he does have a point. Why should I be a part of this? And even reading part 2, a couple chapters in, where you're talking about why we should stay Christian, and I thought, these don't quite outweigh yet in my mind where part 1 was. And then I hit chapter 14, and you asked us to consider an anticipatory Christianity that is leaning towards the future. And I love that phrase so much. I highlighted it. I wrote it down. An anticipatory Christianity, because it describes this stance towards the future in which that doesn't necessarily claim that everything in the future is better than everything in the past, that we're evolving into something better, just something different and newer and maybe better adapted. Would you care to unpack that phrase for us a little bit, how that is bringing you life and hope and
there's
joy?
A lot of ways to do it, but a kind of fun way is to say that both in religion and science, a lot of us inherited a religion where the locus of power was always in the past. So the Big Bang happens, and I bet most of us have seen this in a science movie somewhere, and it's like somebody playing pool, and they hit the cue ball, and the cue ball hits the rack of balls, and everything is action reaction being driven from the past. And that's one way of looking at the universe. It's one way of describing the universe. But there's another way to look at it, to think of the locus of power not just being in the past, but actually being the future itself, that opens, that constantly gives everything a chance to move in some new direction. And a way that theologians have talked about this is to say, instead of thinking of God pushing things out of the past into the future, imagine God in the distant future inviting things to keep moving toward maturity. One of the early church scholars is a very imaginative fellow. His name was Gregory of Nyssa. And Gregory got in trouble with a lot of his fellow scholars because they all bought into this idea of Greek philosophy that perfection is static, because perfection can only get worse. If it could change, it wouldn't be perfect. If it could change for the better, it wouldn't be perfect. So perfection is always static. And Gregory said that's just not good enough. He said perfection is infinite progression. This idea of an endlessly open future for endlessly new possibilities, And so that way of thinking, instead of God sort of being in control, either behind us or standing over us, it's God inviting us into greater freedom and greater wholeness and greater maturity and greater relationship and greater diversity and greater beauty, which is actually what we see kind of unfolding in the universe. There was no Mozart or Bob Dylan or Taylor Swift, 4 billion years ago. And so these things, new things that you never, ever would have anticipated, are baked into the possibilities and have chances to open up. So that's,
yes.
and when we let that kind of almost scientific view also have a theological expression, it helps us think about Christianity not as something that is already set in concrete, but something that is in its very early stages.
It is hard to think about Christianity in its early stages, 2,000 years later, but that can be helpful.
If we can, I think I said before we started recording that, especially reading the first part of your book, where you're providing, many reasons why the answer to your question would be no. That's when I was reading it near my wife, and I would stop and be like, "Oh my God, I have to read this for you." So if I can read a quote to you that just really stood out for me, and I just would love to get your thoughts on it a little bit more. But it's in the chapter, "Because Christianity is a Failed Religion." And at the very end, you talk about, you kind of are speaking to your reader, obviously, of asking if that was harsh to them for people to consider many of the things you've already shared. But you say, if you persist in minimizing these failures of the past and brushing them aside as trivial matters, then please realize, to growing millions of people, you now represent the contemporary failure of Christianity to transform lives. To put it more bluntly, you are a living example of the failure of Christianity, and you are another reason for them not to stay Christian, which resonated with me. I mean, I'm a very emotional person, and I started crying when I read it, but it was just I'd love to know, how did that feel as a leader in Christianity? Many people look to you to write that sentence.
Yeah, I remember writing it, and I have been in so many of those conversations. I won't mention this name just out of politeness, but a leader of people of my generation, and probably your generation would know his name. He died a few years ago, but he was super well known, highly respected on Christian radio and all that sort of thing. And we once had an email exchange, and he gave me permission to go public with it, but I just couldn't do it. And in that email exchange, he said the Crusades weren't that serious. The witch burnings were exaggerated. He just minimized every single thing. And I just thought to myself, you think you're making Christianity look better? And something else I realized about him is that for him, Christianity and Western civilization were fused together. And his defense of Christianity was a defense of Western civilization. And in that way, it was an act of aggression toward Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus. And so it all sort of was of a piece, and I think that's part of what so many of us just don't want to be part of anymore. We don't want to be part of that kind of dismissive, defensive Christianity. And of course, I'm not one to go around and vilify all these people of the past. I mean, they are what they are, and they did what they did, and if I'd been alive, I may have done many of the similar things. But to say that the message of Jesus Christ should not have demanded more of people, it just feels to me like a pretty low opinion of Jesus and his message.
Well, and as I said early on too, I try to live by his message and what he fought for and died for, right? But one other thing you said a little bit earlier in the text, you said, teaching others by their example to live by Jesus' spiritual method of radical, non-discriminatory love and courageous truth-telling. That's gotten me in trouble at times with some. And I don't do it nearly as much as I used to. And Zach has actually said, and some of my science education friends have said that they're really happy that I don't engage as much on Twitter as I used to. Partly because I was blocked by Ken Ham, who is still welcome to be on the show. But what I also have several friends who are members of the LGBTQ community and who are people of faith. And I remember telling one of them one time when we were having a conversation about some of their struggles, and I just kind of said that I believe in a God who loves us for us.
Yeah.
And that if that makes me wrong when I have to face God at the end of my time and I'm told that's not the way it works, my response to my friend was, I don't want to be there anyway. Like if that's what can get me into heaven, if heaven is a place that they say you messed up, you have to renounce that, I'd say I'm going somewhere else.
Yes, that God is not good enough.
Right.
That's just not good enough. My friend Trip Fuller says, look, if your view of God isn't half as nice as Jesus, there's something wrong.
Right. How can Christians take Jesus and look at him in the Gospels and then be like, all right, well, but at the end of it all, we're going to meet scary God and he's going to do the scary judge thing. While Jesus, the guy, the don't cast the first stone guy, he's just going to be in his room because he's a naughty boy or something. I don't know. Why is he not up on the judge? We can affirm that all members of the Trinity are of one substance according to the ancient creeds, but yet won't apply Jesus's examples of grace to the judgments that we fear from God the Father.
There was a Quaker theologian who I just think captured what we're discussing right now so aptly. He said, it was Elton Trueblood, and this isn't a quote, but this is sort of the substance of one of his ideas. He said the Christian understanding of the deity of Christ did not mean that we had a definition of God and Jesus came along and we lifted him up to that definition. He said what this really is supposed to mean is that we had a definition of God and Jesus came along and we had to adjust our definition of God. And I think that's very well said. I think that's what it should have been. I don't know if that is what happened historically, but I think that's how it should have been.
Yeah. If I can pivot here for a second, we've been on some heavy topics. I want to lighten things up a little bit. Your chapter on rewilding ourselves and our faith and humanity itself was far and above my favorite chapter of the book. I highlighted basically the whole thing. It reminded me very much of a conversation those longtime listeners might remember way back in 2020, episode 42, with Dr. Scott, the paleontologist from PBS's Dinosaur
I remembered
Train,
it too. First thing I thought about.
called Reimagining the Natural World was his theory and his the whole devotion he has towards educating children is that in order to save the world from climate disaster, from environmental disaster, we will not do that by better spreadsheets, because nobody is apathetic because they don't know the facts. They're apathetic because they don't care. And so his entire life mission is to help children fall back in love with the world,
I love
to
that.
re-enchant nature, and to get them outside. And even while watching television, to then inspire them to go outside afterwards. Because when you fall in love with the world, then you want to save it. It's your mother again. It's not just a commodity anymore. And reading your chapter about being out on a kayak in the middle of of Florida, and there's gators and birds and fish and the whole deal. I'm there in my mind, and I'm imagining my own slice of wild here in the Pennsylvania mountains. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how the natural world and how this process of rewilding has awoken your spirituality, and how we might best share that with people.
Well, maybe I could just tell you two quick stories. One from yesterday. We had a death in the family over the last week, and so I was out of state. I was in New Jersey for the funeral. And I had to do a whole bunch of interviews for this book. So I was in the home office of my deceased brother-in-law to conduct these interviews. I brought along my microphone and had my computer set up. And right outside his window, there's a dogwood tree. And in the dogwood tree, about 2 feet from the window, was a robin building her nest. And so I was doing interviews literally from, 10 in the morning till 11 at night, because some of them were Pacific Coast time. And so as I sat there through the day, I watched the mother robin come and go, mouthful of mud, a mouthful of grass, and watching her use the shape of her body to form the perfect cup. If you've ever observed a bird's nest, it's just this perfect semi-sphere. Oh my goodness. It's just, and I never gotten to watch that at such a intimate angle. And if that wasn't good enough, just before dark, she was out, I guess, gathering more materials, and a little English sparrow came in and climbs into her nest and steals a bunch of grass. And it was just great. And I just felt like I just got to see a little bit of mischief and theft and all the rest in the bird world. But it just all felt, it just was. There's a poet, what a great a resume. There's a fellow named Lanham from Clemson University who's a biologist and a poet. Isn't that a great combination? And he uses a term in one of his poems, orgasm, that we have these experiences of awe that produce this sort of delight, that goes beyond words. And I that's what I felt watching that all unfold. And then another experience last summer, I've fallen in love with a place I highly recommend it for people who like this sort of thing, called Ring Lake Ranch. It's a Christian-based retreat center, but it's just a place that brings you out into the wilderness of Wyoming, and you get to ride horses and fly fish and hike and just enjoy a place with deep history for the sheep eater people, the Native American people of that area. And I took a hike with a botanist. And as we walked through a Badlands area along the Wind River Gorge, she would everything she talked about was a relationship. We came along, she said, "See that flower there?" She says, "I've never seen that flower in bloom during the daytime. It's a night blooming flower." And she said, "There is one species of wasp that pollinates that flower. and it only comes out at night. And she said, isn't it amazing to think one species of wasp and one flower have evolved to be sort of partners in one another's survival, And then we'd come upon a sagebrush, and she'd talk about, before she was done, you just felt you were on holy ground. It was like a burning bush, but it was the sagebrush because, she explained, this is high desert, and in the winter, snow drifts form around sagebrushes. And that snowdrift then, when it melts, it concentrates moisture around the base of the sagebrush, which helps the sagebrush live, but also becomes like a little oasis of moisture. And then she starts talking about all the creatures that depend on that moisture of the sagebrush. And I mean, you're done, and it's ecstatic to think of the web of life that is around you. And that sense of connectedness, if that's not holy, I don't know what is, And so any kind of Christianity that wants to ignore all that and just look at the world as something that God plans to destroy because he wants to suck our souls up into heaven or send them somewhere else, you just think, what a blasphemy to discount the wonder and glory that's there, in that badlands of the Wind River Gorge.
You talk about that sort of mutual evolution in between things, that when we first were developing the ideas of evolution, the common conception was survival of the fittest, the strongest, right? The beefiest and biggest teeth. And we've learned that in many ways that was just white supremacy reading itself into science. True. When the truth is that it's survival of the most adaptable, the most resourceful, the best collaborators, is survival of those who can work with others best. Is how species evolve and continue. That relationality is just cooked in. It is cooked in.
And if we're going to survive, we have to learn that wisdom from creation. I was honored to be invited to write a book about the Galapagos Islands, so I've had a chance to visit there a few times. And I in my book, I wrote a couple chapters about Charles Darwin, and I got to read his biography while I was there, and then just did a bunch of research. And that term, survival of the fittest, you may know this, it wasn't Darwin's term. And Arthur Wallace, I think it was, Arthur was his first name. He recommended the term because natural selection sounded like it personified nature too much, that nature is making choices like a Calvinist God makes choices. And they wanted to get away from that. When they used the word fittest, it meant fit best. The opposite of the most domineering and aggressive. It's those who fit best. So
yes. You will love my favorite. My favorite new fact in physics that is filling my soul with awe and wonder these days is that you think about the part of the atom that has stuff, right? That has mass, that has the stuff that makes you a thing and not just nothing. Where does your mass come from? Well, only 9% of the mass of an atom comes from the particles of the atom. 91% of the mass of every atom comes from the interaction between the atoms. The forces created by the protons and neutrons generate the 91% of the mass of you and I and the planet and the stars. Everything is a relationship between things. Without the relationship, the things that exist don't exist. And I love that. I mean, that's theological. Right
so literally the weightiest part of the universe is its relationships.
Exactly. It is. If you ever wanted to find a fingerprint of a relational creator who created a creation that continues to create, it's right there.
And this is when you were talking about anticipatory Christianity. This is if what will happen if we're given the chance to incorporate all of these magnificent understandings into our theological work, and not just be stuck under this very low ceiling of Neoplatonic philosophy, which has its own beauties and all the rest. But, so all of this is one of the other reasons it's a little hard to walk away in spite of all the horrible things, because somebody is going to get to do this kind of revisioning of what we mean when we say the word God in light of all of this, and what we mean when we say the word human in light of all of this. And it sort of would be a shame to miss that fun.
It is fun, isn't it?
Well, and, reading throughout your book too about, the interconnectedness of all things, and just the importance of, even stepping back from that, just developing those connections and those relationships. That's something that as a teacher, I do with my students. And, I teach future elementary school teachers how to teach science. And so one of the first things I really focus on is not necessarily let's get into teaching science immediately. It's let's develop a connection to each other, a relationship. And, I've been told by some of my colleagues that they've always been impressed that typically by week 2, I've developed a very strong rapport with my students. And I tell my students this is, my messaging to them all the time is that if you're able to connect with your students on a personal level in some way, you can teach them anything there is.
Yes.
Because they will learn to trust you and know they're in a safe space.
Yes. And in the presence of that kind of respect and affection, and in the presence of that, our curiosity comes out. And so then we become natural learners because we feel safe and all the rest. Oh, it's so true. And this, again, is one of the things that I think we have to realize, that the Christian religion, by working so much on a base of fear and shame, creates an antagonistic environment to learning and curiosity. And it might be one of the factors in the lack of transformation we were talking about before. It makes people sort of hunker down rather than open up.
Well, that's what, part of that too, with developing that relationship and connection is, and it kind of touches on something, Zach, you said earlier when talking about Dr. Scott coming on, is, teaching people to love nature again, is that I approach my class also of teaching them to not fear science.
Yes.
And to realize why it's such an incredible thing to teach, and that children are natural born scientists.
Yes.
Just the whole notion of being curious and wanting to ask a question is doing science.
Yes.
And so I remind them of that. And then I say, now let's have some fun and focus on ways to teach it. But if they can get that down pretty quickly, we're going to have a good time. So,
be a nice thing for seminarians to hear.
I mentioned before we started recording, a friend of mine just wrote his first book called Jesus Takes a Side, Embracing the Political Demands of the Gospel. His name is Johnny Rashid. By the time this episode airs, I think it'll be a week out from release. And in it, one of the things he argues is that Western Christianity doesn't have a sense of honor, but it does have a sense of shame. And most societies are honor-shame based. And his family comes from Egypt, and they have a deeply ingrained system of honor and shame. And honor and shame is how you keep society together, how you keep religion together. But Western Christianity has a lot of shame, but we have no systems of honor anymore. And so we cling desperately to our dogma, our beliefs, our right thinking, because it is so easy to feel shame and so hard to find honor in the system anymore.
Sounds remarkable.
It is, and it's a great book, and everyone should read it. But I think that when we're talking about reimagining the church and reimagining our faith and our religion and what it means to follow Christ, I mean, I can't think of another historical person who spent more time pouring honor on people that other people poured shame on.
Yes.
And if we're going to reimagine this faith, I think we put that near the center.
I love it.
As we're sort of wrapping up our time together, I want to ask you one more question that for me is very full circle. Because back in 2006, I preached a sermon as a teenager at my home church based on your brand new book, The Secret Message of Jesus. A part of that book is in which you talked about how the phrase, the kingdom of God, doesn't work in this post-monarchical world. Nobody knows what a kingdom is anymore. Jesus was using a metaphor for his time that no longer works and probably carries too much baggage for it to be useful. And you propose a dozen different solutions. My favorite one at the time was the dream of God. That was the name of the sermon. I actually just listened to the sermon today. It was very hard to listen to an 18-year-old me preach a sermon, but here we are. I wonder if in the past 16 years, you've found a version of the kingdom of God that resonates deeper with you and with the current reality we find ourselves
very
in.
much so. That's very relevant to our discussion today. There's a chapter in the book called "To Free God," and I have a beautiful quote from Barbara Brown Taylor that plays heavily in the book, and in fact, maybe the way for me to say the phrase is to say that I think this phrase refers to the kingdom of God, and I think it refers to God. In that chapter, I talk about, in Do I Stay Christian, I talk about the you that we refer to God that seems to me becomes a we, because the nature of God, it seems to me, is a God of participation who invites us into participation in the divine life. And so anyhow, the phrase is the web of life. And in fact, I wrote a little table grace that is my table grace for the last several years. And I just say, for this breath, for this heartbeat, for this meal with these companions, for the web of life of which we're part, we give thanks with all our heart. And as I'm saying the web of life, I realize I'm not just talking about that web of life includes God. It's a we that's God and creation in that one web. So that now I think the web is what weighs 91%, or that's 91% of the mass.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It is all about how we are connected to one another.
Well, and if I may ask one more question, Brian, it was based on something you said to us at the very beginning after you talked about your experience with Charlottesville. You said, you kind of alluded to that you are concerned about things to come.
Yeah.
Right? So that was hard to hear.
Yeah.
So what gives you hope?
Yeah.
Because January 6th was rough.
It was rough.
For those of us who admit what happened.
So, Ian, that's really an important question. And in fact, that's going to be at the heart of the next book I write, actually. And I guess one thing I can say is the word hope used to mean for me, where do I see trend lines that make me think things might get better? And I'm not defining hope that way anymore. I'm not defining hope as having anything to do with evidence, or not depending on evidence. Because what I expect, this is what's helping me have hope, to not have to depend on evidence for things getting better. What I expect will happen is that forms of Christianity will get worse than they've ever been. I think that's almost unavoidable. I think I can't imagine it not happening. There are people who want it to happen. They want Christianity to become, in words I would use, uglier, more selfish, more vicious, more violent. And I have no hope that will not happen. That will happen. But here's what I think. As that happens, I'm quite certain that we are seeing and will see extraordinarily beautiful expressions of Christian faith and other expressions of human life as well. Just because the ugliness that we'll see will provoke many of us to step out of sort of complacency into a more vigorous and robust expression of beauty and pursuit of beauty. And the lies and conspiracy theories on the one side will make us more passionate to actually know and face the truth. And of that, of course, I do see evidence. I see our conversation being evidence. All three of us are different than we were 3 years ago. And
Right.
So, it's just all around us. When I was, I said I was out of town, and when I was on a plane coming home this morning, as I walked down the aisle of the plane, I just had one of those kind of graced moments where as I walked down the aisle, this guy is asleep and this woman is tending her child and this older person is reading a magazine. And as I'm walking down the aisle toward my seat at the back cheap seat of the plane, I just felt this tenderness and love and saw the beauty of these people. It was one of those moments where you just sort of, you feel every one of these people is beloved, And I just think more and more of us are moving in that direction. But that won't stop the ugly people, the ugly things from happening and taking over more and more people's lives too. So that's how I survive. I have to be able to expect the worst will happen and the best will happen.
So then we'll just also have to have you back on when you finish that next book.
Okay. I would like that. I
appreciate that response, Brian. That helps a lot.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The book is called Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned. It is available wherever you get your books as of yesterday. Brian, it has been such a pleasure to talk with you for the past hour. Thank you so much for carving time out of your ridiculously busy life to be with us.
It's been such a delight. It's just been a pleasure. I feel energized, and I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. Thanks for having me on, and please keep up this good work. It's important. Thank you.